journey, we wish to hold a series of seminars with people like Gavin Brown, who has a deep love of the valley, a great knowledge, and he spends a lot of time down there being a local. And we hope to get others like him to tell the same sorts of stories in these sorts of venues. Okay, so it's my pleasure to introduce Gavin Brown. I'm sure most of you know him as a local. He's going to tell us the history of the valley. Sorry, come in, see you. Introductions. And we're going to flash through some slides as we go. Over to you, Gavin. I'll brush the machine.
Thank you, Graham. Welcome, everybody. We talked about somebody giving an address about the history of the valley, and we asked Tom Martt to do it, but Tom declined. So I put my hand up and I said, well, I'd give my impressions of the area, and so I'm going to cover basically the Mangatiri and the Mangapurua and the Waipapa and Valleys, and also the Greater Wānui River and that big chunk of no man's land out there. By the early 1940s, the Mangapurua settlement was virtually wound up. Government wouldn't supply any funding for roading. Huge problems with erosion. The settlers were virtually told to leave. And I can sort of feel for those guys, some of them have been in there for 20 years and had to walk out and leave all their hard work. Pretty tough. And Bitumen was the last one to leave, well, the second to last one to leave. McDonald's were the last. And he actually offered to keep the road open himself. If the council would open the road for him, he said he would keep it open, but he was told to leave like everybody else. So basically it was left to the pigs and the possums, and the only guys that kept the road open were the hunters, possumers and the hunters, and the odd people that wanted to walk the old road. And without the hunters and the possums keeping the road open, like Sir Stuart Pearson, when he was a young fellow, he was down there and they did their bit to keep the road open. He took his Land Rover and his bulldozer and all sorts of things when things turned to custard and vehicles went over the side. But yeah, without that, there wouldn't have been any cycleway down there. The track would have disappeared. The bush would have claimed it. Back in the 60s, Lionel West, who was actually my teacher at school, he decided he'd put some sheep down there. So he ran sheep in the Mangatiri and the Mangapurua and the Kaiwhakahuku valleys. And he had quite a number down there. I think it was about 1,500. I should remember because I used to share them for him later on. So, and then Pat Mowat, Tom's dad, and Tom decided they'd put some cattle down there as well. So they were squatting like West was. So they all decided they'd just graze it for nothing down there, which they did. And Lionel was down there in the 60s. I think it was about mid-60s. Tom Mowat took cattle in there in about the 1971. And all the stock stayed down there till about 1985-86 when Doc decided they wanted the valley and they wanted to do something with it. So they said, righto, you guys have got to go. So they had a big muster up and anything was left was shot, and that was the end of the grazing. And that was probably the start of the closing in of the valley because there was nothing to keep things open. After the settlers moved out, it was actually run by the Lands and Survey Department, who ran it right up until 1986. And there wasn't much went on over that period. There was a guy, Wally Remains, who came in there about 1975, and he ran walking trips through there. He had camp set up and toilets were put in for him, I think, by the Lands and Survey Department. And he, I think it was quite successful. I'm not sure how many years it ran, but he had guides at each camp, and they'd take people through and then go back to the next camp, go back to the camp they'd come from. And so that was about all that was done until about 1986 when Doc decided they wanted it and did the administration. there was track work done, but minimal. And then about 6-7 years ago, John Key came up with the bright idea of having a cycleway down there. So they came up with the funding and they decided they would open it up for a cycleway. And for a start, they decided they didn't want anybody else in there. They wanted the quad bikers out and they wanted the horses out, and it was the end of the story. But they came to realise that us horse people and quad bikers and hunters weren't going to go away. We were going to carry on going down there. So we called a meeting, and Doc reluctantly, I think, agreed to have it as a multi-use track, which is similar to the 42nd Traverse. They came up with all sorts of ideas about, there's going to be accidents, cyclists are going to come down the hill and run under a horse and get trampled and all this sort of rubbish. And I just quoted the 42nd Traverse and said, well, that works well. There's always going to be accidents somewhere, so that's where it came to be. I was probably instrumental in the problem with horses down there. I was riding down there and I opened up all the tracks down to the bridge. And unfortunately for me, there was about 6 of us arrived down there one day on the bridge, and we rode out onto the bridge, and Joe Adams was sitting there with a whole lot of tourists on the bridge, and we sort of rode out between them. And I said, "Afternoon, Joe," and I think all the tourists sort of looked around, thought, what the hell's going on here? So unfortunately for us, there was a reporter in the group. Can't have been a very good one because they didn't come and interview us. She reported to Doc. She got hold of George Taylor at the time and said, "There meant to be horses on the bridge?" George said, "No." So anyway, he came up with the idea, ban all horses. And I said, "You've got to be joking. We've had horses on that track for the last 80 or 90 years. And just because you want to put a cycleway in there, I can't see any reason why we should stop going down there." So we had a public meeting. We had quite a few people came along, probably 30 or 40 interested people, when they suggested banning horses down there. And we came to a compromise, and they said, "Okay, you guys can take your horses down to Bartram's," which is as far as the roads formed with the diggers. "And you can even build yourself a corral or a little horse paddock if you like." So, but he said, "We don't really want you on the last 8 k's of the track because that's all hand navied, and horses can make a bit of a mess with their hoofs and things," and which I reluctantly agreed. So that's what we decided on, and that's the way it's been. The old horse tracks are still there. Some of them are pretty hairy. I've had instances of horses over the side, and managed to get them all back, luckily. Stuart Pearson, one of our members here, he spent quite a bit of time down there in his younger days after he left school with a guy called Tom Broadmoor, who was a rabbiter in the area, and he was a very keen pig hunter and possumer, and he had a camp down there. It was called Tom's Camp down at McDonald's, and later on it became still known as Tom's Camp, but everybody associated with Tom Mowat after he had his cattle down there. So it was still Tom's Camp, and that disappeared back in, I don't know, 10, 12, 15 years ago would it be, Stuart? And we think it was burnt down, but that was all right. Things move on. And then we had that big storm in 2004 when we had that summer storm in January, February. Things were very wet, big winds. A lot of the big old pine trees down there blew over, and some of the camps disappeared underneath the pine trees, and that was one of them. I spent a bit of time down there it was just when the cycleway was formed about 4 or 5 years ago. They were renewing the walking bridges down there, which were only 2 planks wide. We widened them to 3 8x2s, I think they were, or 10x2s. And I went and spent some time down there with the guy that had the contract. I just can't remember his name offhand, but we camped down at Bennett's, and it was winter time, pretty cold and wet. And we were replacing the boards on the bottom and putting new slings under under the wires. We didn't replace the wires, but they were tensioned up, and we made them wider for cyclists, but they still had to stand their bikes up on the back wheel and push them across the bridge. So I spent a couple of weeks down there, and then George Taylor wanted some gates made on this side of all the bluffs down there, which was Sheehan's and Battleship and Cody's in the dress circle. He wanted some gates made with this, so that the cyclists would actually get off their cycles and walk round the bluff, so they didn't fall into the gorge. So they gave me a contract to build 4 gates and go down there and swing them, and I made them out of recycled totara, the old way with the mortised ends, and hopefully I think they're starting to grow a bit of lichen and things on them now, and they'll look the part in a few more years' time. But that's only partially successful. About 3 years ago, I think it was, Battleship Bluff was a very narrow track. Over the years, all the papa had come down, fallen onto the road, and slowly that had built up to a little track about yay wide. And someone rode off the bluff and had to chop it out, so suddenly alarm bells ring, and so they raced down there with 2 little diggers, and they spent about 3 months on the bluff, and they dug it right down to the original road level. So you go down there now, and there's a little track where the cyclists go, and most of it's only yay wide. And you come to Battleship Bluff, and here's this huge crescent of road round under the bluff, and you could drive a truck and trailer around there. And I mentioned to Doc, I said, it's a bit of an overkill, and I said, you could have only gone part way down, and you could have had a 2.5 metre track instead of a 6 or 7 metre track. And they said, oh, well, we got so far and decided we would go right down to the original road, which I thought was a bit of a waste of our funds, really. Could have done another bluff for that. Anyway, that's by the by. Yeah, as far as the horse tracks goes, they're all still there. Some of them pretty narrow, slipped away. And when I went down, the last track I had to clear was just the riverside of Bennett's, and there was a big old macacarpa had fallen across it, and I went down in the springtime, and there was I had a pretty good horse, and I had the chainsaw on the horse, and we went right down to Bennett's, and it was actually raining that day. It got quite heavy. I camped at Bennett's for the night, and then in the morning I went down and I cut the tree off the track, and I started to go down to the bridge. I thought, oh, I'll go down to the bridge, and rain got heavier, and I thought, oh, I think I better get out of here. Some of these slips are not that good, and if they get wet, really wet, I'll be in the crap. So I turned around and came home, and that was when I finished opening the track to the bridge, and after that we took the horses down. Yeah, as far as the settlers down there, a lot of the clearings are disappearing, and which I think is a shame, because that's part of the appeal of the Mangapurua for me, is seeing the clearings that's still part of the farms that were chopped out of the bush. Oh, Graham's got a thing up there for me. I haven't got a pointer either. Testers, Staffords, the Waipapa turn off here. And this was off an old 1914 map that my dad had, and he's put in a lot of the Mangatiri settlers too, because my family was down here in the Mangatiri Valley, which is the bottom end of the Waipapa. So here's the road end here with the car park, and got old McIntyre's there, Kaiwhaka you turn off there, which goes down to Whakahora. Then you've got the Waipapa that joined up with the Mangatiri. So you have the Mangatiri landing down here, and the Muramura Road came off the Ruatiri Road back here. So there was a big loop. And the mailman there used to go right round. He'd go down, I'm not sure how far down he went down the Mangapurua, but he came back and went through the Waipapa and then came back out the Murumuru. Probably the longest detour, the longest horse track was, and also in the early days to get round, was Waterfall Creek. And it used to take me 40 minutes to ride up that there, across the waterfall and go back down and carry on down the road. So it's quite a way. A lot of the other detours are only small. And as far as the river, I've probably had a long association with the river. My great-great-grandmother on my mother's side is buried down behind the Rana Hall. Her name was Hohi Martini. And my grandmother came up the Whanganui River to the Mangapurua Valley. She came up the valley here. She came up from here up to, where's the Waipapa? Let's see. Anyway, to where they settled near the Waipapa turn-off, and joined my grandfather there. My grandfather took over the block there. He took over a block after the First World War, which was actually started being farmed or chopped in about 1906 or 1909. So he had a farm that was partially farmed, and he, while he was there, he built another, he chopped another 300 acres. And he was probably one of the lucky ones in there. He had a reasonable farm, and he had the first car in there, and I think he had the first radio, he told me. And he said when the All Blacks were playing, they had the telephone on at the time, and people would ring up to see how the game was going, see who was winning. Now in the latter years, as far as an association with the river went, my two daughters, they did a lot of canoe guiding on the river, mainly for canoe safaris, a little bit for blazing paddles. But between them they did about 12 seasons, I think, on the river. And I did a few trips with them. We did 1 or 2 paid trips, and I did 1 or 2 helping them with their with clients on the river. One particular trip, Cherie had 6 people. They left Ohini, which is south of Taumarui. And she was on her own in the big canoe with all the cooking gear and all the food, and a bit of a struggle on your own. So she said, "Dad, can you come and give me a hand?" So I said, "Yeah, okay, I can't be there Monday, but I'll see you at Whakahora on Tuesday." So I arrived down there and I helped her with the rest of the trip down to Pipariki, and it went pretty well. So yeah, I spent a bit of time on the river, and also I did a couple of trips with Baldy, Robert Baldwin, on his the Adventurer 2, is it called, isn't it, Bob? Adventurer 1, yeah. Did a couple of trips with him, winter trips, pretty cold, but great experience, and I'd advise anybody that hasn't done it to go and do it. And that gave you a pretty good insight into what the early settlers would have encountered going up that river with all the bush and wondering where the hell they were going to. And getting off at the landing and saying, "Well, righto, we'll see you later." And they headed off to their respective farms and or blocks of bush to start their farming. So yeah, let's probably talked about most of that. River boats, people came up the river, the bush. Wives came in later on, clearing the bush by hand. And a lot of course, all the fencing materials were split on site. Put 1 or 2 photos there later on. But the slips and floods and the erosion was really bad later on. My dad tells the story about in 1940, huge rains, and it was showtime, AMP show in town here, and all the settlers from the valleys everywhere were all in town at the show. And it was a huge rainstorm, and it washed out the Maungi Bridge. And so nobody could get home. So Dad and his brothers and some of the other settlers down there, they walked up, they went down to the Raetihi school, They went up the Pukekaha Valley and they went right round the top and walked home and fed dogs and milked cows and shifted stock, and apparently it was over 12 months before some of the families got home. They did put a makeshift bridge. They had a cage across the river after the bridge disappeared, and they put some planks. They did a pretty ready-made bridge across there which lasted for some time until the bridge was rebuilt. Not the one that's there now, but there was a previous one to that. So yeah, no, the carnage was pretty terrible. There was up to 50% of the land went down into the valleys. Of course, that all ended up in the Wainui River and out at Castle Cliff. And so yeah, it was pretty tough times. Excuse me. I first went down the valley when I was 11. My uncle Ray, he still had a lease on the block that my dad farmed, my grandfather farmed rather, down there. He had the Brown block and he had Hancock's, which was round in the Waipapa. And he passed away. My auntie Margaret, she carried on running the stock down there, and I helped later on to, Bill Kinneas was helping look after the stock, and I went down as a young fellow, 17 or 18, helped muster, and we mustered them all out to Jimmy Littlewood's, which was at the end of the Murumura Road, on the Raetihi Road. Took 2 or 3 days, and they were shorn and lambs sold, and we took them back again. But my first trip down there was when I was 11, and Uncle Ray said to me, "You better come down the valley with us, boy, we'll go pig hunting and check the sheep." And so that was all right, and we get down there and we hopped on the horses down at Morris Williams's, which was as far as the vehicles could go at that time. And we rode the horses down the old road. I thought that we're never going to get there. It was about 9 miles, and for a young fellow who hadn't really done a lot of riding, done a bit around the farm, but it's a pretty long ride. And we rode up the Waipapa to what they call Buckley's Cabin, and I think it was actually Bright's. It used to belong to Bright's. And we camped there, and Ray and Fred Bright, they had a couple of whiskies and got tea organised, and then they said, "Oh, we'll go for a pig hunt." I said, "Oh, okay." I said, "Have you got a torch?" I said, No. Just gave me a candle and a tin. And away we went, just up behind the hut and into the fern, and next minute there's dogs barking and pigs squealing, and I was sort of wondering which way to run. Anyway, we got a couple of pigs, and that was my first foray into the Mangapurua Valley. And later on I went to the Mangapurua and did quite a bit of hunting in my earlier days. And then I didn't go in there for very seldom for a long time. I was busy doing other things, and probably 10 or 12 years ago I started going in there, doing a little bit of hunting and also riding horses in there, and because there were a couple of local guys, Jeff Reed and Vinnie Ellis. A couple of local guys, they had a camp down there at McDonald's, and they went in every 3 weeks. They worked out at the pulp mill, and they had horses, and they rode in there every 3 weeks, and they opened up a lot of the old stock tracks, particularly across the river.
Looking at.
So just getting out that ridge there was Mary Island.
Oh, okay.
And Humphreys is on the end. Yeah. From just up the valley road, it's very pronounced. That ridge comes along and it's got a very sharp drop off from the tree. You can shift it around on a different angle and you can't quite see the drop off.
Cool, so thank you everyone. So any questions that you'd like to ask?
Going away back originally when we came out from Warren, how did the settlers that went in there, how did they come by the land? Did they purchase it or was it balloted or how did it come about?
You want me to answer that or? There were sort of various ways. There was a ballot run in which they would have to go in and site the land before they could take it. so many of them made 1 or 2 trips in there. Some could buy it outright, but many of them, like my granddad had a license to lease it until he owned it. So he basically was on a time payment system there. And many were like that, some didn't. So when he left after 20 years, I think he got a payment, I don't know how much, particular, it was supposedly £100 for what he'd paid on the land, and he forfeit the license to lease it thereafter. And the only owner that I know of that kept it was the Coots family, which is where Michael West and Roman West now live in there. Yeah.